Hello and welcome back to the Personal Development School YouTube channel. My name is Gibson. I am an author, counselor, and founder of the Personal Development School. And in today's video, I am going to take you through 10 major signs and symptoms of love addiction for an anxious, preoccupied attachment style. Now, it's important to note that anxious attachment style tends to go hand in hand with love addiction and with codependency. But if you're not familiar with what love addiction is, this is going to be the video to deeply understand it, and you can look for these major signs and symptoms. The very last one may actually surprise you quite a bit, so stick around. But you want to make sure that if you're seeing these specific signs and symptoms, you take a moment to kind of write out or keep a mental track of what these things are, because we will also talk about where they come from so you can plug in what some different strategies are for how to overcome these things. I think before we kick off, it's really important to recognize that love addiction can really be a real addiction in terms of the way it impacts our neurochemistry. I mean, what we know for certain, as an example or analogy, is that when people get addicted to something like gambling, I mean, there's obviously not a physical dependency there, at least not in terms of something we are ingesting. But where the physical dependency technically lies is in the programmed subconscious associations the gambler has to the intermittent reinforcement that come with the punishment reward pathway. And so, if we look at an example, let's say a gambler is playing a slot machine, there's the punishment or absence of the reward so many times in a row before this intermittent positive reinforcement of the gambler potentially winning something in the slots. And then what ends up taking place is when there is that intermittent reinforcement, we can have massive surges in dopamine, cortisol, even elements of serotonin that take place. And these neurochemicals themselves still create and foster a physiological output for us. And so when we look at this, something else that's really interesting in researching about gambling and gambling addiction for different individuals is that when a gambler actually thinks of gambling, their brain actually releases more dopamine than when they are physically doing the gambling itself. And so I think it's just a really important, set of analogies and facts for how much we can still have a physiological dependency on something, not because we're necessarily physically dependent on something we're ingesting, but because the way we perceive something and the stored subconscious associations we have tied into this very thing can be something that actually triggers a lot of dopamine to take place in the example of gambling. When it comes to love addiction, we can actually have a whole lot of serotonin, oxytocin, phenylethylamine, and dopamine. And so, serotonin being the well being neurochemical, oxytocin being the bonding neurochemical, dopamine being the motivation neurochemical, and phenylethylamine actually being the attraction neurochemical. So, when we look at these different dynamics, I think it's important to realize there can be a real element of this definitely here for an anxious preoccupied attachment style. And this tends to have a large relationship to that punishment reward pathway of the intermittent reinforcement coming in and taking place around love. So, we're going to cover these 10 major things. The first big thing that you are likely to see is an intense fear of abandonment. The reason this sets the tone for fostering or creating the breeding grounds for love addiction is because the more intense fear of abandonment, the more negative the feelings are, and the more negative the punishment pathway is. If we look at the punishment reward pathways in the mind. And so when you look at this dynamic of that intense fear of abandonment, what you're essentially going to see is that if there's some perceived pulling away or change in the dynamic of a relationship or a pattern that shifts or changes with an anxious preoccupied person and the person that they're dating or seeing, well, that intense fear of abandonment is going to be triggered. And then when that abandonment fear is quelled because somebody sends a nice text or does show up for the date or follows through or you spend time with them in person, the reward on the flip side of that, relative to how painful it felt, is going to feel much more strong. And so, this intense fear of abandonment can actually set the tone as one of the major foundational building blocks to create love addiction components. Number two, a preoccupation with the fantasy bond of a relationship. So, what you'll see is that the fantasy bond, right, that the anxious preoccupied person may create, they're actually rewarding themselves, right? So if we look at the reward pathways here, what we're going to see is that for anxious, preoccupied individuals, they're when they build this bond of like all the things that could happen, the dates they'll go on, the conversations they'll have, the intimacy that will take place as they feed into these like ideas. They're actually creating this really rich fantasy world and they're creating the neurochemical output that they're largely dependent on the first place that fosters that love addiction component, just like we talked about in that study where research demonstrated that gamblers would actually produce more dopamine when they thought about gambling, aka fantasize about gambling, than they would when they were actually doing the physical gambling. And to the same sort of token, like what you'll see is it's because in the fantasy world we have more control. So if the gambler thinks about gambling, they're not thinking about losing at gambling. They're thinking about winning and all the winning and the unlimited fantasy access they have to all the things that could take place. And following that same pathway in the fantasy bond, we often idealize a relationship. We think of all the perfect moments, the best moments, all the great things that could occur. So that fantasy bond building can also create this dynamic for the punishment reward pathway to foster love addiction. Number three, we may see that an anxious, preoccupied person has a difficult time meeting their own needs. The less empowered I feel to meet my own needs as a person, and this applies to everybody, the more of a sense of like not desperation because it's too strong of a word, but honestly, like for lack of a better word, desperation I'm going to feel for somebody else to meet my needs. Because what happens is when I don't know how to meet my own needs or I don't know what my needs are, I'm in a state of learned helplessness. And now I'm much more reliant or dependent on somebody to come along and meet those needs for me. And so when I don't have access, right, to it's important to recognize here that the subconscious mind sees its needs as its sense of self. And so the more that my sense of self is not being fed or nourished, the more I'm going to have this like really intense need for somebody to do that for me because it feels like it's almost a survival response. Like, I need this. I'm desperate for it. I need to survive by getting my needs met. And if I can't do it, I need somebody to do it for me. And so, the more of an absence we feel in terms of how we can um, get the needs met that we're looking for through love addiction, the more likely we are to have the breeding grounds for love addiction take place because our relationship to those needs when somebody meets them is going to feel really extreme. It's kind of like saying, as an analogy, if you are super hungry and you haven't eaten in 4 days, when you eat food, it's going to taste different and you're going to experience it differently than if you just ate food 3 hours ago. And so that's what I mean in terms of fostering that love addiction component. If we don't know how to meet our own needs, which is a big struggle for anxious, preoccupied attachment styles, then you're going to see that dependency, that depth of the experience when somebody does meet them is like literally eating food after not eating food for 4 days. Number four, if there is a tendency towards really overthinking things. So what we'll see is anxious preoccupied attachment styles, they tend to really overanalyze things. But when we overanalyze things, especially as APs, you'll see that you tend to overanalyze in the negative. The reason being is that our subconscious mind is very survival oriented. So our subconscious mind will essentially want to think of all the bad things that could happen so it can protect you from them. But when the focal point of the bad things that could happen have to do with other people and things that are out of our control, the mind usually fills in the blanks, aka what we don't know for sure or don't understand about other people, with our own individual worst case scenario fears. So you may see as an example that um, with an anxious, preoccupied person, they will go through their social interactions with a fine tooth comb or their romantic interactions, especially in the case of love addiction, with a fine tooth comb, and they will think through everything that could have gone wrong. And they will project their unresolved core wounds onto these experiences. So they'll think, oh my gosh, this person doesn't like me. I ruined everything. I'm about to be abandoned. What if they fall out of love? What if I'm an unloved person or not good enough? And they'll tend to project those fears. And again, the more extreme our punishment and reward pathways are around this, the more the reward will feel massive relative to the punishment. And so the more we're feeding into both pathways of this, the more of the breeding grounds we are still building for love addiction. And if you see yourself as like somebody who totally overanalyzes and overthinks, your interactions as an anxious, preoccupied attachment style, you may see here that this is actually creating the exact context. Like you'll see this is a natural sign and symptom. Now, it's important to note at point number 4 here that not every single person with anxious preoccupied attachment style has love addiction, right? It's not every single person's experience. It is individuals who have like just as an example, you might see a securely attached person with like a bit of an anxious preoccupied secondary style, or somebody who's like 50-50 SA and AP. And in that case, you will likely see somebody who's anxious preoccupied, but doesn't have like a full blown love addiction. Whereas somebody who's a really strong anxious preoccupied person may be much more likely to have full blown love addiction. Number 5, a sense of being very possessive or jealous in terms of this need for that connection. The more we don't know how to meet our needs, the more we tend to try to hold on very tight to the things or people that will. In the case of love addiction, you will see that if you're an anxious preoccupied and you don't feel like you can meet your own needs, you of course are going to be possessive over the people that do, right? Of course, because your subconscious associates this with survival, but you will definitely see a much stronger escalation of jealousy and possessiveness with somebody who actually has a love addiction as an AP versus somebody who's just, has some anxious preoccupied in their attachment style. Number 6, you will see people who struggle with love addiction. They tend to have a really strong tendency to catch feelings very fast. So they will tend to want to move very, very quickly in a relationship. They may, for example, have a meeting with somebody or a date and feel like this person's the one, I know it, and then try to escalate everything very, very quickly and even settle down and make a commitment in a matter of a couple of weeks. And you will see that this tends to be a pattern for this person over and over and over again in their life and relationships. And this brings me to number 7. You may actually see that somebody with love addiction has a tendency to never really be alone. So they may go from relationship to relationship and actually like not even really heal or process a past breakup before getting into a relationship with another person. Actually, almost to the point where sometimes I'll see people who are anxious, preoccupied with love addiction literally go from relationship, and then when they know that they're not interested in this person or the relationship isn't going well, they'll actually try to find somebody who they think they can hit it off with before exiting a past relationship as a means of just getting it. I mean, when we look at it in the reality, if we think of like a gambler as the analogy here again, that person's addicted. So they are going to do whatever they can to not have to be without their addiction. They're going to go to great and extreme lengths. So we can definitely see this pattern follow suit here for an anxious preoccupied when it comes to love addiction. Number 8, you will tend to see that individuals with love addiction have a very difficult time coping with breakups unless they are moving into a new relationship right away. So they may find themselves feeling just a sense of being completely frozen, not able to process their feelings, not able to do like normal everyday things like go to work, have conversations with friends, spend time being present with family if they're so devastated from a breakup and then they don't have somebody else there in a romantic way, because it literally, I would actually compare this, obviously not necessarily to the same degree, but it can definitely be along the same trajectory. I would compare this to somebody who, as an example, like is going through withdrawals from a substance, right? We can see these really strong, painful dynamics taking place. And, gamblers can go through their own variation of withdrawals, and you'll see this again along the same trajectory for people with love addiction. And this brings me to number 9. People pleasing, which you'll see can be a very, very difficult one. And we can see this people pleasing really going hand in hand with just being absolutely terrified of rejection. So you'll see that people with love addiction, it's like they will do everything to keep their addiction. They will please to the nth degree as a means to maintain proximity to their addiction, right? This is something that you'd see very commonly in other circumstances and would apply along the same kind of pathway here too. And number 10, you may see that individuals, when they're really struggling with love addiction, have a huge roller coaster of emotions actually throughout the relationship. So, I think we think of people with love addiction as just wanting to like settle down, stay close, maintain proximity, but we can actually see that people with love addiction, they'll have these really extreme highs and lows throughout the relationship dynamic itself because of all of the really strong fears that they may have in regards to the loss of that person. And those fears, even though the person with love addiction, would want to do anything they can to not sabotage the relationship, unfortunately, often really strong emotions can lead to more extreme actions and behaviors, which can, the more polarized and extreme things are, the more likely we are to accidentally sabotage things. And so sometimes the very thing that the love addict doesn't want to have happen will actually take place because of the love addiction itself. So I have some exciting news, which is that we are doing $1,000 off of our lifetime membership sale to the Personal Development School, which means you get access to literally everything at PDS for your entire rest of your life. Essentially, that entails all of our different courses you have lifetime access to. I do 4 live webinars a week, every single week. You can access them ongoing, and you get access to all of our daily community events. So I'd love to see you on the other side, and you can access it by using the link in the description box below. So that's it for this topic today. I do want to note that if you do struggle with love addiction, you find yourself really moving through a lot of these symptoms and seeing this within yourself, you can dive into the Anxious Preoccupied Reprogramming course. It definitely targets love addiction at the subconscious level. You can run through it for free for 7 days using the link in the description box down below. And as you dive in there, if you want to go through the whole course in 7 days, if you cancel before the 7th day, you'll never be charged anything. And this is a great opportunity if you want to move through these things to understand the reprogramming tools. They're laid out for you in the workbooks. You can print them off and really dive in there and get your PDS journey started. And within that 7-day period, you'll also have access to all the courses inside PDS, the webinars with me 3 days a week, along with different attachment coaching webinars that we have. So we have a webinar almost every single day and social event almost every single day to build community, to connect with like-minded people, to go through this journey with others so you're not having to go through it alone, and get lots of access to ongoing support on a daily basis as you're working through your course progression. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching here. Please like, share, and subscribe. Please hit the thumbs up button or the notification bell so you don't miss any of the daily content here. And I really appreciate you being here and watching. And let me know any other questions you have in the comments down below.